In the spring of 1887, the settlers along Antelope Creek found a new thing to talk about, and her name was Maren Holt. She was planting sunflowers. That alone meant nothing. Half the homesteads in Dakota Territory grew a few along a fence to keep the bees busy and give the children something cheerful to look at. But Maren was not planting hers along a fence. She was planting them against her cabin, not in a bed near it, against it. The seeds went into the soil only a hand's width from the bottom logs, in a tight, unbroken line that hugged the foundation all the way around the house. A man riding the creek road could watch her for an hour and still not understand what he was seeing. She worked on her knees in the cold spring mud, pressing each seed into the ground with her thumb, then shifting 6 inches and doing it again. North wall, east wall. The shaded side where nothing grew well. The side that caught the worst of the wind. She did not skip a single foot of it. Behind her trailed her boy, Soren, 8 years old, carrying a tin pail of seed and dropping a few into her open palm whenever she reached back without looking. An old dog named Bram lay in the doorway and watched them, the way old dogs watch work they have decided is none of their business. By the end of that first week, the Holt cabin stood inside a thin, brown furrow that ran clean around it, like a chalk line drawn by someone planning a fence that would never be built. And that was when people stopped passing by and started slowing down. Because on the frontier, a warm spring day was not something you spent on flowers. A warm day was for breaking sod and mending the harness and patching the roof before the next storm tore at it. Every hour had a price, and everyone out there knew the price. So when a widow with a young son and no man to help her spent 6 straight days on her knees planting decoration into the dirt against her own walls, people did not think how pretty. They thought how strange. And then they thought how foolish. Across the creek, on the higher ground where the grass came in thicker, a cattleman named Caleb Renner leaned on his fence one evening and watched the last of the light go out of the sky behind the Holt place. He had been watching the widow's planting for the better part of the week, and he could not make sense of it. He was not a cruel man. He had carried venison to that cabin the first winter after Henrik Holt died, and he had never once heard Maren ask anybody for anything. But this was different. This looked like the kind of thing people did when grief had finally tipped them over. The next morning he rode down and stopped at her gate. She was kneeling at the south wall with mud to her wrists. "Mrs. Holt," he said. She looked up, waited. "Those flowers." He nodded at the furrow. "What are they for?" Maren went back to her seed. For a moment he thought she had decided not to answer him at all. Then, without looking up, she said, "They're for the cold." That was all. "They're for the cold." 4 words that told him nothing. He sat his horse and chewed on them and found they only made the whole thing stranger. Flowers were summer, cold was winter. A sunflower was dead and brown long before the first real storm ever came down out of the north. He opened his mouth to say so, then thought better of it, touched his hat, and rode home. He did not understand it, but he remembered it. And by the time the next winter was finished with the Antelope Creek country, Caleb Renner would understand it better than almost anyone alive. Word travels fast in thin country, and there was not much else to talk about that spring. It reached the general store at Larkin's Crossing first, the way most news did. August Pruitt ran the store, and he ran the credit book that went with it, which meant August Pruitt was the man who decided every autumn whose family would have flour and lamp oil and nails through the winter, and whose would have to do without. That gave him the kind of authority a man can get drunk on, and August had been drunk on it for years. When a freighter mentioned the widow planting flowers up against her cabin, August laughed so hard he had to set down the sack he was lifting. "Against the cabin," he repeated. "Well, there's a woman who's given up on the harvest entirely." The story went from the store to the schoolhouse steps, and from the steps to the Sunday benches, and by June there was hardly a soul along the creek who hadn't heard about it and formed an opinion. Most of the opinions were unkind, and most of them came down to the same idea, that a woman alone, 2 winters a widow, had finally let her sorrow grow up over her like a weed. They started calling the place the Flower Fort, said with a grin. Said the way you say a thing about somebody you've decided is harmless, and a little bit sad. Maren heard it. There is no such thing as a secret in a country that flat. She heard it from the boys who shouted it across the schoolyard at Soren until he came home with his knuckles skinned, and she heard it from the women who went quiet in a particular way when she walked into the store. She never answered any of it. She never explained herself to a single person. She just kept on with her work, and when the seeds came up, she kept the rows free of weeds, and when the young plants leaned, she set them straight. And it was the silence, in the end, that kept the thing alive. If she had argued, people would have argued back and gotten bored and let it drop. But she gave them nothing to push against, so the talk kept rolling, and underneath the laughter, a few of the steadier heads began, very quietly, to wonder. Because Maren Holt had never been a foolish woman. She had buried a husband and held a homestead alone, and brought a herd of half-wild milk cows through 2 winters that broke stronger families than hers. Whatever else she was not the kind to waste a season on nothing. What none of them knew was that Maren had not invented any of it. She was only remembering. The remembering went back 20 years, to before she was Maren Holt, to before she had ever seen Dakota. She had come over from Norway as a girl of 11, and the family she crossed with had run out of money somewhere in eastern Kansas. To earn their keep, Maren had been hired out for 2 winters to a settlement of Mennonites who had come from the Russian steppe. Quiet, careful people who farmed wheat the rest of the country had never seen, and kept their barns warmer than their neighbors kept their parlors. The woman she worked for was named Katarina Reimer, and she was old even then, with hands like roots and almost no English at all. Katarina had grown up on the grasslands above the Black Sea, where the winters came howling off 1,000 miles of open steppe with nothing to slow them down. Her people had farmed that country for generations, and they had learned things there that the American settlers, who measured the land in seasons rather than centuries, had not had time to learn yet. One of those things was the sunflower. To the Reimers, a sunflower was not a decoration, and it was not even mainly a food, though they took the seed for oil and for the hens. A sunflower was a tool. When the heads were cut in the fall, the stalks were not pulled and burned. They were saved, bundled, stacked thick around the things that had to be kept from freezing: the root cellar, the well housing, the wall of the barn where the milk cows wintered. Katarina stacked them the way other people stacked firewood, with the same care, because to her they were just as much a part of surviving the winter as the wood was. Young Maren had watched her do it without understanding, the same way Caleb Renner would one day watch Maren without understanding. And one cold afternoon, with her arms full of dry stalks, the old woman had said something to her in her broken English that Maren had carried for 20 years without ever quite knowing why. "The wind is hungry," Katarina had told her. "You give it something to chew at the gate, or it eats the walls of the house." At 11, Maren had thought it was just the way old people talked, a saying handed down so many times the sense had worn off it. She had nodded and stacked her stalks and forgotten it for the better part of her life. Then Henrik died. Henrik Holt had been a good man and a careful one, which was the cruel part, because careful men were not supposed to be the ones the winter took. He died in December of 1885, a little more than a year before Maren ever planted a seed. A storm had come down faster than the sky had promised, the way they did in that country, and Henrik had gone out into it to bring the cattle off the open flats before the drifts closed over them. He knew better than to go far. He always knew better. But the snow came so thick and so sudden that the world went white from the ground up, and a man could stand 20 feet from his own door and not know which way the door was. They found him 3 days later, less than a quarter-mile from the cabin, sitting against a drift with the lead rope still wrapped around his wrist. He had been walking the wrong direction the whole time. The storm had simply turned him around and let him wear himself out. After that, Marin did not think about the winter the way other people did. Other people thought of winter as a hardship to be endured, a long gray waiting between one harvest and the next. Marin thought of it as a thing that was alive and patient and looking for the way in. She had felt it reach into her house and take her husband from 20 feet away. She knew, in a way her neighbors did not yet know, that the cold did not need much. It only needed a gap, a weakness, a wall that was not quite warm enough. And one night, that first winter alone, sitting by a stove she could barely afford to feed, listening to the wind pull at the chinking between the logs and feeling the cold come through the wall at her back, even with the fire roaring, Marin remembered Katerina Reimer's hands full of dry stalks. She remembered the old woman bundling them against the barn wall. She remembered the saying she had carried 20 years and never used. "The wind is hungry. Give it something to chew, or it eats the walls." She understood it now. It had never been folklore. It had been a system, a working thing that had carried Katerina's people through worse winters on harder ground than anything the Antelope Creek country had ever seen. A loose, deep layer of dry stalks packed against a wall did two things at once, and Marin had watched both of them happen without ever knowing she was watching. The thick tangle of stems and leaves broke the wind apart before it could strip the heat off the logs. And inside that tangle, between the stalks, it held a deep cushion of still air that the cold had to fight its way through inch by inch. Still air does not move heat well. That is the whole secret of every warm thing in the world, from a bird's feathers to a wool coat. It is not the thing itself that keeps you warm so much as the dead trapped air inside it. Katerina had wrapped her barns in still air, and Marin, sitting alone in a cabin the wind was eating alive, made up her mind that next spring she would wrap her house the same way, not to be pretty, to live. She told no one. There was no one to tell who would have believed her. So, in the spring of 1887, she simply went out with a pail of seed and her boy behind her, and she started. The first real test came in July, and for a day or two it looked as though it had ended the whole experiment for good. The plants had come up strong. By midsummer they stood waist-high and climbing, a thick green ring all the way around the cabin, broad leaves rattling in every breeze. People had stopped laughing quite as hard, mostly because the thing had started to look less like a sad joke and more like simple good work, even if no one could say what the work was for. Then a storm came through. Not a winter storm, a summer one, the kind that builds up purple and yellow in the western sky in the afternoon and comes down with hail in the front of it. It hit the Holt place broadside. The wind laid the grass flat across the whole basin and drove hail the size of musket balls into anything still standing. When it passed, a good third of the western ring had been beaten down into the mud. Stalks snapped and bent and shredded, leaves torn to rags. Caleb Renner rode past the next morning on his way to count his own losses and saw the ruin of it. He reined up and looked at the flattened row for a while, and he was honest enough with himself to feel something that was not quite satisfaction, but was close to it. Well, he thought, that's the end of that then. The hail did what nobody could talk her out of. Tobias Frey thought the same. Frey built houses and barns up and down the creek and had for 15 years, and he had been saying since spring that the whole notion was womanish nonsense. When he heard the storm had flattened the flower fort, he said it had saved Marin the trouble of finding out the hard way. But the next morning Marin was out before the sun. She did not pull the broken plants. She lifted them, the ones that could be lifted, and she set new stakes deep along the western side. And she ran lengths of twine from stalk to stalk so that the whole row was tied together and could lean on itself when the wind came again. The ones that were past saving she cut and laid aside in a careful pile. Because dead or living, a stalk was a stalk, and she had a use for every one of them coming. She worked at it for the better part of a week. Soren worked beside her, and Bram circled the whole business, keeping the cows off the soft ground. By the end of it, the western ring stood again. It did not look the same. It was rougher, patched, propped here and there, but it was no longer a row of separate plants that the wind could take one at a time. It was a single braced wall, every part of it holding up every other part. The storm had not broken the idea. It had only shown Maren where the idea was weak, and she had gone and made it stronger. Caleb noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. A man learns to tell the difference between someone who is fooling themselves and someone who is solving a problem, and what he had watched that week did not look like a woman fooling herself. Tobias Frey was not a fool, and that was what made his objection sting. He came out to the Holt place in August, when the ring had grown back tall and the heads were beginning to nod heavy with seed. He did not come to be cruel. He came because he was a builder, and the thing offended him as a builder, and he believed he was doing Maren a kindness by saying so, before it was too late. He got down off his horse and looked the ring over, walking the whole way around the cabin with his hands behind his back, the way a man does when he is inspecting work he means to find fault with. Maren went on tying twine and let him walk. "You've put a great deal of labor into this," he said finally. "I'll grant you that. So I'll be plain with you, because nobody else seems willing to be." He pointed at the stalks crowded up against the bottom logs. "You're going to rot your walls out. Pack green stuff against wood. The wood can't dry. It holds the wet. The wet gets into your logs and your chinking, and inside of 3 winters you've got soft wall where you used to have sound wall. I've torn down houses that died of less." Maren kept tying. "And the mice," Frey went on. "You're building them a town. Every field mouse and pack rat between here and the river is going to winter in that, and from there it's 6 inches to the inside of your house. You'll be overrun by Christmas." He saved the worst for last, and he lowered his voice for it, because it was the one that frightened him on her behalf. "But the rot and the mice aren't even the danger," he said. "The danger is fire. You've wrapped your whole house in dry tinder, Mrs. Holt, and you've got a stovepipe coming out the top of it throwing sparks every time you bank the fire. 1 ember. 1. On a dry night, with a wind. And you and that boy don't walk out of it." He shook his head. "I've seen prairie fires take a sound house in 2 minutes. I won't tell you a thing about what a fire does to a house that's already wearing kindling for a coat." It was, every word of it, a reasonable thing to say. Every man along that creek knew that damp wood failed, and that mice followed cover, and that fire was the thing that killed more homesteads than cold ever did. Frey was not speaking from spite. He was speaking from 15 years of pulling down houses that had died exactly the way he described. Caleb, who was there that day, found himself agreeing with nearly every word of it, and feeling sorry for her, and a little ashamed at how relieved he was that the saying of it was Frey's job and not his. Maren finished her knot. Then she straightened up, and for the first time she answered. She did not argue the rot, because she had already thought about the rot. She walked Frey to the wall and showed him that the stalks did not lie against the logs at all. She had set a course of flat stones along the foundation in the spring, and the ring stood on that, with a hand's width of open air between the dry stalks and the wood, so that the wall could breathe and the wet had somewhere to go. She did not argue the mice, because she kept 3 cats and a terrier-blooded dog, and intended to keep more. And the fire she had thought about longest of all, because the fire was the one that could kill her. She showed him the bare ring of turned earth she kept hoed clean all the way around the outside of the stalks, a fire break as wide as a wagon, not a blade of grass on it. She showed him that she kept the ring nearest the stovepipe side cut lower and thinner than the rest, and greener, watered late into the fall, so that even an ember had little to catch on the chimney side. And she told him quietly that she would rather take her chances with a fire she could see coming and run from than with a cold. She could not see at all, that came through the wall in the dark and took a person 20 feet from their own door. Frey did not have an answer for that. He stood there a moment, then climbed back on his horse. To him it still looked like a woman who had made up her mind and dressed up her stubbornness in reasons. He rode off shaking his head, but he had not been able to point to a single thing she had not already seen coming, and that, more than any argument, stayed with Caleb Renner the whole ride home. The fall came on, and the talk thinned out, because by then the country had real work to do and no time to spend on the widow's flowers. Maren cut the heads in October. She took the seed, for the hens, for the oil she pressed in a little hand press Henrik had bought her years before, for the children at the schoolhouse who got a paper twist of roasted seeds in their pockets and forgot, for a few weeks, to call her boy names. The seed was good. It would have been worth the planting on its own. But she did not pull the stalks. She left the ring standing right where it was, brown and dry and rattling now, and to the bundle of cut stalks she had saved since July she added every stalk she could cut or trade or carry, until the ring around the cabin was no longer a row of plants, but a deep, dense, packed wall of dry stems, knee-thick at the bottom, built up course by course like a haystack and lashed tight against the staked framework she'd been bracing since spring. She filled the gaps with the chaff and the broken pieces. She packed it deep on the north and the west, where the killing wind came from, and kept it lower and thinner on the south, where the sun and the chimney were. By the time the first hard frost silvered the grass, the Holt cabin sat inside a wall of dead sunflower that came up past the windows on the weather sides. From a distance it no longer looked like a house at all. It looked like a haystack with a chimney, a brown mound rising out of the flat, a single ribbon of smoke standing up off the top of it. The new name for it, that fall, was not a kind one. The boys at the school called it the widow's grave, because that was what it looked like to them, a low, mounded thing with a person living inside. Maren heard that one too. She let it go like all the rest. Caleb Renner kept watching from across the creek. He had stopped expecting to laugh. He did not know what he expected any more. He only knew that the woman over there had done a great deal of careful, patient, unhurried work towards something, and that whatever it was, it would either prove itself or fail in front of the whole country the moment the real cold came. And the real cold was coming. He could feel it the way the old-timers said you could. An early stillness in the air, a hardness to the light. It was going to be a bad one. Everyone said so. They were right. The blizzard of January 1888 came down out of the north on the 12th, and the people who lived through it never forgot the date. The morning was almost warm. That was the trap of it, the thing that made it a killer instead of merely a storm. The sun came up soft, the wind dropped, and after weeks of bitter cold it felt mild enough that children walked to the schoolhouses in light coats and farmers went out to their stock without thinking twice. All across the Dakota and Nebraska country, people stepped out into a kind morning and let their guard down. The storm hit Antelope Creek a little after noon, and it did not arrive the way storms usually arrive. There was no slow build, no darkening hour to read the sky and get home. There was a line on the northern horizon, low and rolling and the color of slate, and then the line was on top of them, and then there was nothing at all but white and a wind that came on like a hand, slammed flat against the whole country at once. The temperature fell so fast that men caught out in it told of feeling the warmth pulled out of their wet clothes in a single minute. By the middle of the afternoon it was 40 below the freezing mark with the wind behind it, and the wind was running better than 60 miles in the hour, and a person could not see their own boots. The snow was not falling so much as flying sideways, fine and hard as ground glass, packing into every seam of a coat, every gap in a wall. It went on like that, without a single break, through that whole night and the whole of the next day and into a third. In the Renner cabin, Caleb fed his stove and watched the chinking on his north wall and could not get warm. The wind found every gap in his good sound house and reached through it. He banked the fire as high as he dared and still felt the cold coming off the wall at his back, the way Marin had felt it 2 winters before. He thought of his cattle out in it and knew without going to look that he was going to lose stock, that everyone was. And once, somewhere in the worst of that long howling night, he thought of the widow and the boy across the creek, sitting inside their haystack with their flowers, and he was glad it was not his job to go and find them. He could not have gotten to them if it had been. No one could go anywhere. The country had simply closed. But across the creek, inside the wall of dead sunflower, something was happening that none of the men who had laughed would have believed if they had not seen the proof of it later in Marin's own hand. The wall was working. The blizzard struck the outer face of it first, and instead of slamming straight into a cabin wall the way it slammed into Caleb's, the wind ran into a deep, ragged tangle of 10,000 dry stems and broad dead leaves and hollow stalks. It could not pass through that cleanly. It broke apart on it. A storm wind is a single great river of moving air, and all of its strength is in the moving. The sunflower wall took that single river and shattered it into 1,000 small swirls that ran into each other and canceled each other out, until what finally reached the bare logs of the cabin, deep inside the wall, was not a wind at all anymore. It was a slow, spent, confused little draft, with nearly all the killing strength wrung out of it. And in the deep tangle of the wall, in all the countless small spaces between the stalks, the air sat still. Still air, packed 2 feet thick all the way around the house. The cold had to cross that on its own, slowly, with no wind to drive it, and still air is one of the best things in all the world for holding heat exactly where it is. The stove inside the cabin was not fighting the whole weight of the storm the way Caleb's stove was. It was only quietly replacing the little heat that crept out through 2 feet of trapped air. It barely had to work at all. Then the snow came, and the snow, which everyone took for the enemy, turned out to be the wall's best friend. The driving white packed itself deep into the outer face of the sunflower, filling the gaps, locking the loose stalks together, until the whole wall froze into one solid mounded shell. And a thick blanket of snow is itself one of the warmest things the winter has to give. The same reason a fox sleeps under a drift and lives, the same reason the deepest cold never reaches the ground beneath deep snow. The storm, fighting to get in, had sealed the house inside a second wall of its own making, better than the first. So the outer face of the sunflower wall was being torn at and stripped and beaten down, whole sections of it on the north side shredded away into the dark. That was the wall doing its work, spending itself, taking the punishment so the cabin would not have to. And, deep behind the ruined outer face, the dense inner courses held, packed and frozen and full of still air. And behind that, the bare logs of the little cabin held their heat through 3 days of a storm that was killing grown men and full-grown cattle out on the open ground a 1/4 mile away. Inside, Marin kept her stove low and her account book on the table, and in it she wrote down, the way she did every cold night, the date and the reading off the little thermometer Henrik had nailed by the door and how much wood she had burned. She had been keeping that book all winter without telling a soul. She was not keeping it to prove anything to anyone. She was keeping it the way Katerina Reimer's people kept everything, carefully, because careful was how you lived. But it was going to prove something all the same. Soren slept in his father's old coat by the stove. Bram slept against the boy. The wind screamed 2 feet away on the far side of the wall and could not get in. The storm finally let go of the country on the morning of the 14th, and the silence that came after it was its own kind of strange, a flat, ringing quiet after 3 days of noise that had never once stopped. Caleb Renner spent the first hour of it digging the snow away from his own door, which had drifted shut to the eaves. When he finally got out, the country he stepped into was not one he recognized. The fences were gone, buried. The familiar shape of his own yard had been remade overnight into a stranger's. And his house, his good sound house that Tobias Frey himself had built, had a new crack open in the chinking of the north wall where the storm had simply driven the cold straight through, and a wood box that was all but empty, and a thermometer that had not been above 20 below the inside of 3 days. He saw to his stock what was left of it, and there was not as much of it left as he wanted there to be. And when that grim work was done, he found himself standing at his fence, looking across the creek at the Holt place, and he could not stop himself. He had to know. Part of him expected wreckage. He told himself, walking the long cold way over the drifts, that he was going to find that haystack flattened and torn open, and a cold dead chimney over it, and he braced himself for what he might have to do for the boy. The whole notion had always looked so fragile. 3 days of that wind should have stripped it down to bare logs. Then the cabin came into view, and Caleb stopped where he stood. The wall was still there. The outer face of it was a ruin, true. Whole sections on the north and west had been torn away and scattered, and what was left was beaten flat and frozen and crusted over with snow and ice. But the core of it still stood, packed thick against the logs all the way around, and the cabin inside it was nothing but a low white mound now, snow-covered to the roof line, with a single thin ribbon of smoke standing straight up off the chimney into the still morning air. Not the heavy black smoke of a stove being fed everything its family had, the way Caleb's own chimney had smoked for 3 days running. Just a thin, easy, ordinary ribbon. The smoke of a house that was warm and meant to stay that way. He walked up to the door and knocked the snow off it, and Marin opened it, and the warmth came out at him so strong he felt it on his face like sun. Inside, Soren was sitting at the table eating a bowl of mush. Bram lifted his head, decided Caleb was no one to worry about, and went back to sleep by the stove. No one was wrapped in blankets. No one had the gray pinched look of people who had spent 3 days fighting the cold. The wood box by the stove was still better than half full. Caleb stood in the doorway and looked at the half-full wood box, and then he looked at the thermometer by the door, and then he looked at the small worn account book lying open on the table, and Marin saw where his eyes had landed. Without a word, she turned the book around and slid it across to him. He read it. He did not have to be a clever man to read it. The dates ran down one side, and the readings ran down the other. 3 days of the storm laid out plain. He did the figuring against his own house in his head, and the figures would not let him pretend. Through the worst of it, the inside of his sound house had run more than 20 degrees colder than the inside of her haystack, and he had burned, to lose that argument, nearly twice the wood she had. Caleb closed the book. He walked over to the nearest wall, where the bare inside of the logs showed between the chinking, and he laid his bare hand flat against it. It was warm, not hot, not heated, just warm, the way a thing is warm when it has held onto its own heat instead of giving it up to the wind. He had not felt his own walls do that in 3 days. He took his hand down slow. Then he looked at the widow, and the boy, and the sleeping dog, and the half-full wood box, and the little book of figures that had just finished an argument the whole country had been having about her since spring. "I was wrong," he said. That was all. It did not need to be more. The storm had already said the rest of it. Spring came back to Antelope Creek the way it always did, slow and grudging, the snow pulling back off the low ground, and the creek breaking loose of its ice, and the first green showing along the south-facing banks. The country counted up what the winter had taken, and it had taken a great deal. There were empty places at the church benches that spring. There were homesteads that nobody came back to. The blizzard of '88 had cut a wound through that whole country that the old people would still be talking about 50 years on. But on the Holt place, when planting season came around, the seed went into the ground exactly where it had gone the year before, against the cabin, all the way around. And this time, nobody slowed down on the creek road to wonder at it. Because that same spring, Caleb Renner did a thing that set the whole valley talking again, though not the way it had talked before. The first sunflower seed he planted that year, he did not put in the garden, and he did not put it along a fence. He put it against the north wall of his house, in a tight line a hand's width from the bottom logs, exactly the way he had watched the widow do it 2 springs before and not understood. He had understood now. He had a wood box and an account book of his own to thank for it. A few people noticed. Most of them pretended not to, because there is nothing harder for proud people than admitting out loud that the one they laughed at was right. But by midsummer, 2 more families had quietly done the same. The year after that, it was 5. And after that, it stopped being something anybody had to decide to do, and just became something people did, the way you bank your fire or set your meat in the cold cellar. Tobias Frey never once stood up and said his objections had been foolish, and the truth is, they had not been foolish. The rot and the mice and the fire were all real dangers, and a careless person could have died of any of them. But Frey was a builder before he was a proud man, and a builder, faced with a thing that plainly worked, does not argue with it. He studies it. He came out to the Holt place that second summer, and this time he did not come to talk Maren out of anything. He came with a measuring string. He looked at how she set her stone course to keep the wood breathing, and how wide she hoed her fire break, and how she thinned the ring on the chimney side, and over the next few years Tobias Frey worked out better ways to brace it and bind it and keep it safe, and he built those ways into the new houses he raised up and down the creek, and never quite said where the idea had come from. He didn't have to. Everyone knew. August Pruitt stopped telling the joke. The joke had stopped being funny the morning Caleb Renner planted flowers against his own house, and a joke that has stopped being funny is the deadest thing on the prairie. The whole business simply went quiet, the way a thing goes quiet, when it stops being something people fight about and turns into something people use. And somewhere in those years, the name changed. No one decided to change it. It just changed, the way names do. Nobody called it the Flower Fort anymore, and nobody called it the Widow's Grave. By the time Soren Holt was grown and farming his own ground, the rings of dead sunflowers stacked around the cabins of Antelope Creek had a plain and honest name, the name of a thing that works. People just called them the winter walls. The years went on, the way they do. Soren grew up and got tall and outgrew the boys who had thrown the old name at him across the schoolyard, most of whom were planting winter walls of their own by then. Bram's muzzle went gray and then white, and he spent his last winters sleeping by the same warm stove he had guarded through the great blizzard, and one spring he did not wake up, and they buried him under the cottonwood by the creek. Inside the cabin, Henrik Holt's pipe still sat on the windowsill, where Maren had set it the winter he died, and his snowshoes still hung by the door, and after a while nobody who came through the place even noticed them anymore. They had simply become part of the house, the way the winter walls had become part of the country. Maren Holt lived a long time, long enough to see the rings of brown sunflower stacked around homesteads clear to the river, around houses whose owners had never heard her name and never wondered who had been first, who taught their children that the walls had always been there, because the walls had always been there for as long as the children could remember. Long enough to see a thing she had carried alone, in silence, through a whole season of laughter, become so ordinary that people forgot it had ever been strange at all. That is the way it usually goes with the things that turn out to be true. People remember the storms and forget the laughter that came before them. They remember the walls and forget the widow on her knees in the spring mud, planting decoration, they all said, against her own house. What survives is not the argument. What survives is the thing that worked. A wall of dead flowers, a pocket of still air, a few words from an old woman on the Russian steppe, carried halfway around the world, and handed down to a country that had not yet learned it needed them. And every year, somewhere out past the edge of the last fence, the winter came down again out of the north, looking for the way in, the way it always had, the way it always will. It hunted for the gap and the weakness and the wall that was not quite warm enough. But by then, all up and down Antelope Creek, the walls had learned the old lesson that the widow learned first, and the country learned the hard way. The strongest wall is not always the one that looks strong. Sometimes the thing that saves you is the thing they laughed at, and sometimes it looks like nothing more than a ring of flowers, gone brown and dead and forgotten, waiting all winter long for the one storm that will finally prove what it was for.